Hello, everyone, and welcome to the talk by Dr. Leslie Gross-Wyrtzen. She is a postdoctoral associate with the Council on African Studies and teaching fellow at the Center for Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration at Yale. She will be talking today about outsourcing otherness with race and belonging in the Morocco-EU border. So the way the seminar is going to be organized, so first Leslie is going to sort of introduce the topics and discuss, give her presentation, and then she will take questions after her presentation. If you could please, you can send the questions on a chat or just raise your hand, and then we'll make sure that Leslie replies to you. Make sure you introduce yourself and say who you are. She just sent a chat as well if you want to have a few words. Okay, so I think Leslie, if you want to start.
All right, can everyone hear me? Thumbs up? Okay, wonderful. All right, well, thank you very much, Teresa, for this invitation to speak to you all today and to be here with the Program for Refugees, Forced Displacement, and Transnational, and Humanitarian Response. And Tarana, too, who's doing a lot of the back of the house work right now, you know, she'll help facilitate your questions and let people into the room. In general, I just am grateful to be here at the Macmillan Center that houses this program, as well as the Councils on African Studies and Middle East Studies, which has been just a wonderful place to think about migration and border enforcement. And thank you to those of you who are here today. I just want to welcome you and encourage you to use the chat, to introduce yourselves, to say what brought you here, to, you know, pose questions or ask questions of each other as well as me. And after I talk for a little bit, we'll have some time, hopefully, for not just question and answer, but for kind of a more collective discussion, because I think a lot of people are bringing all kinds of professional and personal experience into this. So this is one day after we in the United States commemorate Indigenous Peoples Day, and I want to locate myself here on the traditional lands stewarded by the Quinnipiac people, who were subjected to violent mobilities of colonial settlement and forced displacement that continue to shape the geography of the U.S. settler state. So I'm really mindful of when I talk about mobility and violence in other contexts, that I am very much interpolated both in that context and in my home country and my home geography as well. So like Teresa said, I'm hoping to talk to you for about 30 to 35 minutes, and you know, and then we'll have time for discussion. So today I am drawing on my research on the Euro-African border in Morocco to make the case that race and racism, and especially in the context that I investigate, Blackness and anti-Blackness, are central to determinations about whose mobility is subject to control and how that works. So before I go any further, though, I want to unpack a few terms. So when I talk about the Euro-African border, I'm speaking of the network of governments, law enforcement agencies, humanitarian organizations, defense contractors, smuggling rings, and other entities that are implicated in the control of people's migratory movements between Africa and Europe. And this network has grown out of the EU and individual member states' shift in the mid to late 1990s toward outsourcing immigration control to neighboring countries whose participation is enlisted through various diplomatic and financial incentives. And just a little side note, Nora El-Qadim is a person who problematizes maybe the incentivization of the externalized borders. So if you want to know more about that, I encourage you to look up her work. Most scholars call this sort of outsourced border the externalized border, or border externalization, and you'll hear me refer to it in this talk in that way. So in the externalized border, walls and fences certainly play a role and definitely draw much of the media attention. But the border signifies something much more expansive. It's a political and economic complex whose reason for being depends upon the criminalization of certain groups of people's cross-border movements. Further, borders aren't just inert barriers, be they physical, institutional, algorithmic, legal, or social, but active processes of inscribing inclusions and exclusions throughout social space. So in this way, borders are productive. They aren't just about restricting or inhibiting, but they're generating relations, subjects, and spaces. So when I talk about race, I'm not referring to unchanging identities or categories whose meaning is fixed across time and space, but instead I understand race as a category of difference produced through ongoing processes of racialization with local and trans-regional, as well as historical and contemporary valence. So what this means is that being Black in Morocco, for example, is not the same, even though it resonates with being Black in the United States. And as we'll see in a bit, neither is being white in Morocco the same as being white in the US, or in Mauritania, or in South Africa, or in countries in Europe. When I argue that race, and especially Blackness, is central to mobility control in the Euro-African borderlands, it means it isn't just that the border targets Black people, but that it produces people as Black, collapsing their multiple identities into a single figure of the Black or African migrant. And further, it assigns meanings about Blackness that legitimize the violence against people conceived as fundamentally out of place, not just in Morocco or Europe, but within the realm of the human. And by the way, slides and pictures, so you don't have to look at me the whole time, are coming, but I just want to get this introduction first. So to unpack this, I'm going to tell you a story about a conversation I had in the midst of field work in 2017 and 2018 among West and Central African migrants who'd found themselves stranded in Morocco. This story points to the ways that the Euro-African border is not just reorganizing transnational economic relationships or challenging notions of sovereignty and territory, which are concerns that border scholars have taken up, but is reworking the social in significant ways across Morocco, and I would argue by extension throughout the Euro-African borderlands. My approach builds on decades of feminist critique of scale and ethnographic research in order to understand how the bodily and the global mutually constitute places and people. Thus, thinking about the border ethnographically requires attention to the daily embodied experiences of people who encounter, reproduce, and transgress it. And in my work, I argue that migrants are implicated in all of those actions. So through a relational lens, I trace connections rather than distinctions that characterize the border's operations and migrants' experiences in specific places within what Ruben Anderson calls the extended field site, the Euro-African border. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you now. All right. So I conducted most of my fieldwork in Fez and Meknes, which are two central Moroccan cities that have been host to growing numbers of West and Central African populations. This is in part due to the Moroccan state's shift a few years previous to this research from a practice of apprehending migrants in the northern part of Morocco, which I refer to as the frontier region or the frontier zone, near fences that separate Morocco from two Spanish enclaves, Melilla and Ceuta, that you can see on the map. Formerly, the state had rounded up folks attempting to breach the fences or cross the Mediterranean on boats, or sometimes just rounded people up who were phenotypically Black in the northern cities and dropped them off in the desert at the Algerian border. This practice has been widely denounced by human rights associations in Morocco and in Europe, and was replaced as part of a humanitarian reform of Morocco's border policy. So what replaced it instead were these internal deportations in which any Black non-citizen, in the words of one report, in the frontier zone were still rounded up, but rather than dropping them in the desert, they were bused south to cities in the country's interior. This practice of pushing people back from the northern border zone to more remote southern locations mirrors the EU's region-wide strategy of pushing migrants from its southern and eastern borders into countries like Morocco, Libya, and Turkey. These are countries that have fewer resources and infrastructures to accommodate them. And I think part of this border externalization and the pushing back that is happening or creating a buffer zone is something that just keeps getting replicated on a smaller and smaller scale. So once in Fez or Meknes, migrants were often dropped off near the train station or bus station, and encampments were established in empty lots adjacent to them. And this is true not just in Fez or Meknes, but in many cities across the country. Many people newly arrived from the north stayed in these encampments or moved to overcrowded rooms in working class neighborhoods where they survived by begging on the street or engaged in informal work. One effect of this policy was that it heightened the visibility of West and Central African migrants on Moroccan city streets, reinforcing the link between Blackness and unauthorized or undesired migration. This heightened visibility and conflation of Blackness with illegality impacted different communities within Morocco in several ways. So first, it concealed the fact that many of the people migrating to Europe from Morocco without papers were in fact Moroccan nationals. Second, it reframed how people perceived the presence of many Sub-Saharan students with legal papers. So these Sub-Saharan students have long been present in Morocco and actually are brought to Morocco through a program that the state sponsors. And finally, it's impacted Black Moroccans whose belonging has always been racialized, but is now being animated by anti-Black migration politics. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. So in Fez, I worked closely with a research partner, Freddy, or as he likes to say, he had a driver. Several times a week, I would meet him at the McDonald's in downtown Fez, where we would have a quick breakfast and then spend the next 6 or so hours visiting migrant communities and in the outdoor encampment adjacent to the train station or in a working class neighborhood. Freddy wears lots of hats. Himself a former migrant from Cameroon who took the land journey from Morocco when he was a teenager. He's now a social worker with a church-based NGO and with a Moroccan-based NGO focused on HIV prevention. He's also the leader of the Cameroonian community by virtue of his seniority in the country and his important positions with NGOs. In his social worker role, he responds to urgent health and social services needs of all Black people, as he says, in Fez. People from Cameroon, Nigeria, Guinea, Mali, Ivory Coast, and so on. His phone never stops ringing, rounding up blankets for newly arrived people dropped off at the camp by Moroccan border police, calling supervisors to ask for the release of funds so he can pay for prescriptions for migrants who are experiencing hypertension or to purchase insulin for diabetes. He's accompanied pregnant women to their prenatal visits to provide translation, identifies bodies at the morgue and arranges for a burial in a pauper's grave, helps someone arrange their self-deportation, and will file applications for 1-year regularization program for moms and for mothers and children. And as Cameroonian community leader, he mediates disputes between individuals, visits people in prison, and while I was there, arranged for a sex worker who was not getting along with her madam to be transferred to a madam in another city so that she could be safe. Often when I dropped him off in the neighborhood in the early evening, he had hours more calls and visits to make. So after 6 or 7 months as Freddy's chauffeur, I took a short vacation to the Tafilelt, located in the southeast of the country near Morocco's fabled sand dunes. The Tafilelt oasis system runs along the Ziz River between the provincial capital of Rashidia to the north and Erfoud, the gateway to the Sahara, as tourist operators like to say, to the south. The Tafilelt has fascinated generations of anthropologists also for its diverse and tangled cultural, religious, racial, and ethnic makeup. Arabs, Jews, Black or Arab Berbers, descendants of slaves, so-called white Berbers, descendants of the prophet, the Shorfa, or of holy people, and so on. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A, or I can point you to some excellent resources, including Hussein Elahian's work. So though I didn't travel to the Tafilalt to study the border, I encountered it anyway. The internal deportations that had contributed to more West and Central African migrants living in and stranded in Fez and Meknes were now being diverted to more remote and economically marginal towns further south or further in the Moroccan interior, including both Rashidia and Erfoud, each a short distance away from where this picture is taken. Indeed, in Fez, I met many people who'd been pushed back from the northern border to Rashidia, to Beni Mellal, or to Tiznit before making their way back to Fez or heading back to the northern frontier to try to cross the border again. So on my visit to the Tafilalt, I was chatting with Fatima Zahra, an Amazigh or Berber activist, about my research among migrants experiencing these internal deportations and how I thought the practice seemed to be reinforcing or intensifying anti-Black discrimination against both migrants and Black Moroccans. She responded with the local version of the argument I've heard many times since moving to Morocco in 2001. In the Tafilalt, there have been African immigrants for centuries as a result of the trans-Saharan slave trade, but despite their unfree status, they suffered no discrimination in Moroccan society. Pointing to a sepia-toned picture of a traditionally garbed man on the wall, she said, "My grandfather owned 2 slaves, and he treated them very well." The problem, in her view, arose from changes in land tenure that had allowed les Noirs, by which she was referring to both the descendants of enslaved West Africans and indigenous Black or Arab Berbers, access to property formerly controlled by les Blancs, which would be non-Black Berbers. In addition, because descendants of enslaved and Black indigenous people were now considered members of tribal groups, they were able to sit on local councils and influence decisions about developing or selling off communal land. She traced a square on the table with her fingers and added, "Now that African migrants are arriving in the region, the Amazigh are being invaded on all sides." So there are many things that we can unpack about this vignette that speak to the specific character of racial politics in Morocco, including questions of indigeneity, race, descent, property regimes, kinship, and filiation. But what really struck me about these very local struggles with decades and in some cases centuries of built on centuries old categories of social difference and corresponding power and resource inequalities was that they were being interpolated into this very recent transnational Euro-African border. So what I'm going to spend the rest of our time on today is showing how the border is producing the social, especially in regards to race, in places far from the walls and fences, and how the politics of belonging in Morocco is increasingly being articulated in the register of race. And I want to touch briefly on how outsourcing or externalizing border enforcement from Europe to its neighbors can enable the concealment of European culpability, but it also can offer a way to trace the border's logics and operations across vast spaces. Next, I'll discuss Morocco's racial history and contemporary context in which the border intervenes. And then finally, while Blackness is consolidated as a signifier of otherness, I propose that it has facilitated or deepened mobilizations against white supremacy throughout the Euro-African borderlands. Okay. Teresa, I'm assuming you will intervene if there's something going wrong. So I'm just going to keep going because all I see is the PowerPoint. So I just found this map and I think it's wonderful because it gives you a sense of this externalized border. So according to this map, the blue dotted line, which goes through the Mediterranean, is sort of where the European border is imagined. I'm not exactly sure why it runs through Turkey in this case, but maybe we can talk about that. But then you have the neighbors. You have North Africa, North African countries who participate in containing and preventing migrants from their own people, and then also from other places from reaching or crossing that border. And then I think what this map also shows is that the externalized border is moving further and further south through various other kinds of research partnerships so that the whole journey from, say, for example, Cameroon to Libya or to Morocco is heavily bordered and is overlaid with various agreements between states and contractors and other people. So my colleague Lorena Gazzotti and I recently authored a piece that subjects analytical concepts common to border and migration studies to post-colonial critique. We argue that uncritical use of externalization runs the risk of reproducing colonial narratives of Europe as the agent of history. Following Aino Corvin's Syria, we argue that externalization's presentism, the idea that it's unique, and also that migration is new or is a crisis, is ahistorical. European powers have been subverting African autonomy for centuries, as Martin Lemberg-Peterson has argued, and imposing various mobility regimes that facilitate or suppress the movement of precarious people. Nevertheless, externalization also enables us to move beyond uncritical analyses of border enforcement that center individual states. So it allows us to trace relations of power and circuits of capital that structure the transnational, heterogeneous Euro-African border. When used critically and historically, externalization can help us discern the connections that obtain across scales and among different actors. By bringing such connections to the fore, we can track transnational circulations of race and racist ideologies that are central to the animation of local, specific racial formations and histories in places like Morocco. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these histories before turning to how they articulate with border externalization in Morocco today. I wonder if I can move this. I don't know if that's in the way. Oh well, I'll just leave it. For a long time, there's been silence around the subject of race in Morocco, both in public conversations, but also in academic scholarship, where it's often folded into discussions of ethnicity. Despite this silence, race and racialization permeate Moroccan and Maghrebi societies. Shouki El-Hamel points to the pre-colonial and Islamic roots of the black-white binary, suggesting that perhaps the Islamic Mediterranean influenced or shaped the racial hierarchies that became entrenched in the Americas. The trans-Saharan slave trade reverberates in Moroccan social relations, as evidenced by the use of the word el-abd, slave, to refer to a dark-skinned Moroccan, and the persistent idea that phenotypically Black Berbers are not actually indigenous. The colonial project in Morocco and across Africa has linked whiteness to superiority and modernity, and Blackness to tradition, prehistory, and underdevelopment. Today, the accretion of anti-Blackness is discernible in myriad ways that include racial profiling by security agents, the casual use of racist language by ordinary Moroccans, and the frequent appearance of blackface and racial stereotypes in entertainment and media. And you can see an example here. This was a really famous example that came out recently because Miriam Hussein here is expressing her solidarity with US protests, the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And the way that she decided to do this was to wear blackface. So as anthropologist Laura Menon has argued, racial formations and racisms are local, particular, and contextual. This is a common position among both historians and anthropologists working on questions of difference in the Maghreb and the African continent as a whole. What's important about this perspective is that it safeguards against imposing analyses or theories derived from other contexts to the Moroccan one. But going back to the point made at the beginning about scale, context is never only local. And indeed, the local is always bound up in relations that extend well beyond the particular location. I think Fatima Zahra's story gets at both this relationality and its contingency. Morocco is not a blank slate when it comes to race relations or racial politics, but neither is it closed off from the past or present global racial ideologies and geopolitics. Tracing the border as it connects as well as separates Africa and Europe makes it possible to see how race circulates, is transnationally constituted, and bound up in systems of power that cut across local and international, reworking, intensifying, unsettling, and refusing meanings in various places. So again, Europe's outsourced border enforcement program and the ensemble that now comprises the Euro-African border is impacting not only notions of Blackness, but reinforcing hegemonic conceptions of whiteness across Moroccan social space. Blackness, which has long been a signifier of inferiority in Morocco, has become consolidated with illegality, with riskiness, and with out-of-placeness, sticking, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, to other people who are not explicitly the targets of border violence. So this is the case with Timothy Hucks. Timothy Hucks was a US English teacher who, while living in Rabat, was rounded up by police and internally deported to the south of the country. He had stepped out of his house to run a quick errand and left his passport at home. Police did not believe that he, as a Black man, was a US citizen and thought he was an undocumented migrant. Lorena Gozzotti has written about how in Morocco, Black people are routinely policed and deported regardless of their legal status, while at the same time, white Europeans who overstay their visas can expect few consequences, none of them violent or immediate. While Hucks eventually returned to Rabat and then to the United States, and I think his citizenship had something to do with his ability to move, Alain Toussaint, another teacher and legal resident originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, was similarly rounded up and died after being thrown from a moving bus during an internal deportation. So the conflation of Blackness with out-of-placeness attaches to Black Moroccans as well. During field work, Black Moroccans recounted examples of how other Moroccans would mutter racial epithets under their breath, like at the hanout or market, assuming that the person didn't understand Moroccan Arabic. And in a poignant example that a friend told me about, he was watching, in 2017, he was watching a sports program, and a Moroccan TV journalist was on the streets in Casablanca interviewing people about an upcoming soccer match. When the journalist encountered a Black Moroccan, he switched to French, assuming the man was a foreigner. The man replied in Moroccan Arabic. They went back and forth like this, with the interviewer not believing the man was Moroccan, until he finally said in exasperation, Aish al-Malik, long live the king. In contrast, whiteness has gained more salience as a way to assert one's authorization in space, at the national scale, but also at other scales. So like Fatima Zahra, many Moroccans that I spoke to would probably refer to their identity as white, as their identity as Muslim, Arab, or Berber, perhaps Jewish, or more commonly just Moroccan, but referred to themselves as white in reference to Black or African migrants. So drawing a distinction between so-called African migrants and themselves helped them to fix a boundary that aligns the Maghreb with Europe at the expense of producing Africa, using the language of European apartheid, as beyond the pale. The global pandemic has exposed how harm is directed to racialized, gendered, and othered people in societies structured in dominance. The murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in my country has provoked worldwide protests and solidarity with Black US citizens, but it's also prompted testimonies from Black Arabs and other Black Middle Eastern and North African people about the pervasive discrimination that exists both in the diaspora and in their home countries. Significantly, many of them are naming the marginalization and violence they experience as anti-Blackness and expressing solidarity with Black migrants and other African diasporas. So these are two social media campaigns that I want to just talk about for a few minutes. There are many of them that have proliferated in recent years, or in recent months, I should say. So Kahwa and Black Moroccans are providing platforms for Black identifying Moroccans and members of the Moroccan diaspora. Black Moroccans, as far as I can tell, is also affiliated with activists and artists who were involved in the 2014 campaign, Masmitish Azi, which is, my name is not Azi, Azi connoting a very pejorative word for a Black person. So both of these Instagram accounts, like other accounts that focus on the Gulf or Iran or the Arab world as a whole, are comprised of a mix of historical and contemporary images of Blackness in Morocco, as well as testimonies of Black and Afro-identified people speaking to their experiences with anti-Blackness in their home countries. And this is one example. I think that this is the organizer of Kahwa Half Half, but I haven't gotten in touch yet to confirm that. So many of these testimonies explicitly point out that racism is not just something that happens in the United States or in Europe, but is something that's also woven into Moroccan society. And these Instagram accounts provide a platform where Moroccan nationals and Europeans of Moroccan descent reject the pressures to orient toward whiteness, instead embracing Blackness and Africanity, along with Moroccanness, Europeanness, Indigeneity, or Arabness. They write and speak about identity and sociality in ways that destabilize not only the Manichaeanisms of Black-white binaries, but also monolithic ideas about racial identity and belonging. Their commentaries invoke the local and Moroccan specificity of Blackness and anti-Blackness, and how these are entangled in transnational and transtemporal notions of value and humanity. I think these are really exciting. I could go on, I'm going to wrap up really soon, but I could talk about these for a long time. So tracing the afterlives of slavery and European colonialism, they connect the condition of the Haratin in Morocco and Mauritania to that of Les Beurs in France. They interrogate the role of anti-Blackness in Islamic history and jurisprudence. They protest foreign capitalist and militaristic interventions, and so on. Their epistemological vision is relational and social, simultaneously grounded in place and specificity and mindful of the larger cross currents that we all get drawn into. Black Moroccans, with its roots in immigrant solidarity and anti-racist activism, and the more recent Kahwa Half Half, emerged from, I would argue, a milieu shaped by the Euro-African border's production of Blackness as Otherness. The transnational project of bordering Blackness has also enabled West and Central African migrants, Black Moroccans, Moroccans in the diaspora experiencing anti-Islamic or anti-Black discrimination, to assemble a transnational African diaspora that refuses Blackness as negation and instead understands Blackness as conditioning the possibility for new internationalist and decolonial futures. And I think that's the last example, yeah. Okay, so I think Teresa is going to help me do this, but if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or I don't know, what do you think, Teresa? They can unmute themselves?
Yeah, they can unmute themselves. There was already one question on the chat from Taslim about the map that you show. So I think if you want to ask the question yourself.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So thanks for the question, Taslim. So you said, are the yellow bits countries that are partnering with North Africa to protect the red border? I think a lot of that, so I guess I won't go back to it, but I think that most of this, because a lot of the funding is still driven by the European Union, these are partnerships that comprise sort of multiple layers of partners that include often Europeans, North African states, and people in the states in the Sahel and Western Africa, for example. So I don't think it's tiered in the sense that Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Libya cooperate with Europe, and then, you know, Mali and Mauritania and Niger cooperate with Morocco and Algeria. But instead it's, you know, it's these multiple layers of programs that contribute to that across the board. And I see a question from Lydia that asks if there are any Moroccan researchers working on these topics, Blackness, externalized borders, et cetera, in Moroccan universities. So I think the answer to that is yes. There are, particularly working on the topic of the externalized border, there are quite a few, both doing research affiliated with institutions in Europe and North America, but also working within Morocco. When I first came to do research in 2017, I met with 3 researchers from Meknes who were doing phenomenal work on the border and on migrant experiences there. And Kishkesh is the last name. I'm blanking temporarily on their names, but I can pass them along. In addition, my colleague and I, Lorena and I, just co-edited a volume for the Journal of North African Studies that came out online this summer that features a few researchers from the region, and actually one migrant who is speaking about the externalized border and their experience in Morocco. So yeah, so that's some of that. In terms of Blackness, I do think that there are some people from the North African diaspora who are starting to ask these questions. University of Pennsylvania, the Middle East Studies department there has had some really interesting work. I'm really bad with names. Afifa Latifi, I believe, is from Tunisia, and is thinking about these questions from a historical perspective. And yes, of course, Saeed Murad points out as well. Saeed Sadiqi has been talking about this for a long time. And then, of course, in terms of Blackness, Shouki El-Hamel literally wrote the book on Blackness in Morocco, and that book has recently been translated into Arabic. Okay, Zainab asked, what did I mean by relational epistemologies? And this is when I was talking about the Instagrammers. I think the emphasis that I'm trying to make here is that these phenomena are neither completely local, nor completely like deterritorialized or global only, but they are constantly in relation to each other. And that also the way that these protests are seeing themselves is not in a comparative sense, where they're trying to show that anti-Blackness in Morocco, for example, is commensurate with maybe anti-Arab or anti-Islamic racism in France, but trying to constitute or organize solidarities that recognize that a lot of this has to do with white supremacy, it has to do with capitalist development and uneven development in the world, and has to do with, long histories of colonial intervention as well. Any other questions or I'm also really happy to hear comments from folks too, because I imagine you have opinions. Okay, so Iman said, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about how the presence of sub-Saharan Africans in Morocco conceals the fact that many of the people migrating to Europe from Morocco are actually Moroccan nationals, and how that affects the Morocco-EU relationship. Thanks for that question. These are really great questions, all of them. Yeah, so I think this is something that I talk about in some of my other work, but the way that I think about it is that in Morocco's participation in the externalized border is often framed as containing or preventing the mobility of people from sub-Saharan Africa. And, as many of us know, Moroccan nationals constitute the largest non-national population in Europe, many of whom, of course, arrive by legal means, but not all. But it's reworking. When I first moved to Morocco in 2001, there was a lot of discussion, and you see this in literature as well, a lot of discussion about Moroccan migrants or Moroccan immigrants who are trying to get to Europe. And I feel like that discourse has shifted, despite the fact that really the numbers of people moving from Morocco to Europe from West or Central Africa are still quite small. So I think it reframes, for Morocco, it reframes the problem of migration, if migration is at all a problem, as something that is from outside, that is from West or Central Africa, rather than something that is related to Moroccan nationals themselves, if that makes sense. And of course, you know, the EU is also addressing the issue of Moroccan national migration. But one of the things that they do in exchange for Morocco's cooperation is offer more short-term visas for agricultural laborers and people like that, as well as student visas, and facilitate some of the ways for people to go work in Europe or join family in Europe more easily. But some of that is, at least in theory, contingent upon Morocco's cooperation in keeping West and Central Africans out, or keeping them from crossing the border. Does that make sense, Iman?
Yes, thank you so much.
This is Taslim. I wanted to ask you if you see parallels in this situation here relative to the US South American. Like, we had this caravan. I'm just going to use the words that the media used. So the caravan and coming through, and then the US trying to partner with Mexico to make that border further. I mean, it kind of reminded me of this whole situation here when you described the Moroccan situation. I'm wondering, like, what are the parallels and differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot. I think there are a lot of parallels. And now I'm going to just make things up, but I feel like the EU sort of pioneered this, and the US jumped on board, but I could be wrong about that. But I do know from people doing research in Mexico that there's increasing numbers of Central American migrants who are stuck in Mexico, and the US is pushing them back, right? Instead of, they're trying to intercept them before they cross, or right as they cross the border, so that they don't have to deport them. They can push them back into Mexico, and then it becomes Mexico's problem. And the conditions for Central Americans has gotten much worse. And my understanding from, from folks either doing research in Mexico, or actually just from Mexicans that are living there, is that discrimination and sort of anti-Indigenous racism against Central Americans has become a huge, has become significant in the way that the Central American migration is characterized now in Mexico. And I think the US, I know that the US funds some of that just the way that the EU funds it, but Donald Trump apparently doesn't know that, so.
Because that also that I think you call it like the frontier zone. It's starting to feel like that too, on that border, on the Mexican side of the border, of that space where people who are stuck, who are setting up.
Completely. And now that asylum claims are either not being processed or processed so slowly, that there's just like more and more people are amassing on that border. And then, of course, the United States has 100-mile buffer zone around all of its borders. Yeah. So that's another thing, and it can act with a certain level of impunity that doesn't apply in other places in American territory. So, yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much, Leslie, for your talk. I was curious if you can speak to the sort of humanitarian laws governing these deportations, because I am curious. I am thinking so much about, African migrants who are going into Italy, and you have, these Italian boats that are supposed to save them, and then you have these asylum laws, and you have, of course, the humanitarian laws that they can't, I don't know, I think I encountered this concept of reformer in thinking about the South American border, where you can't, legally send people back who are in danger. So is there any sort of, this partnership between the EU is, I guess, quite concerning when thinking about the laws that also the EU and the UN uphold in terms of humanitarianism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll just say the first thing that comes to my mind is I get so mad when people are rescued in the Mediterranean by being sent back to Libya, right? Or I get Morocco. I have like a Google alert that says Morocco and migrants, and it'll say like Moroccan, Coast Guard rescued, a certain amount of migrants in the Mediterranean. When really it's like intercepting and pushing them back or bringing them back to Moroccan territory. So that like discourse, those humanitarian discourses get really enmeshed. And that isn't to say that there isn't rescue also happening in the Mediterranean, but those discourses get really enmeshed with security and with securitization. And so it's a really complicated situation. In 2014, Morocco, for which they should be lauded, reformed their migration policy. And some of the things that they did was to offer 2 periods of exceptional regularization where people could actually get residency permits for a year or more, a year, and it could be renewed. In addition, they, at least on paper, or at least aspirationally, would provide healthcare and education for kids and for other people. I'm trying to think what else off the top of my head, but those are like pretty significant, particularly if you think, if you compare them to the context of the United States right now. It is something to be lauded, but what it did is kind of put people, it kept people from traveling where they wanted to travel, and in some cases it just put them on hold because they were still not able to get jobs. They were still experiencing police violence. They were still at the risk of being rounded up at any moment and being mistaken for someone that didn't have residency papers. Also, there were limits in terms of who got regularized and who didn't, and how long you had to have been there, and whether you were there at the right time. So I think actually probably a little bit more than in the United States-Mexico context, humanitarian language and sort of liberal discourses about human rights get deployed a lot, but not necessarily, they're not inscribed into law in the same way. And, just to do a little bit more press or shameless promotion, the Journal of North African Studies special issue that just came out on this has some articles that specifically address that. And one of them is by Katarina Natter, and she talks about how, how this sort of liberal discourse and humanitarianism on the Moroccan state enables it to be authoritarian in other ways. So, we have the Hirak conflict, or repression, I guess you would say, and we're seeing a lot more media experiencing oppression in Morocco. Women have been subjected to court cases related to their sexuality and things like that. So there is a way too in which this like humanitarian language conceals other kinds of behavior. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Does that answer your question, Faith?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great. Jennifer, you said, yes, when you talk about resistance to the fact or regarding, Jennifer, can you tell me what you said? I missed the first part. Can you clarify?
Sorry, I had ridiculous number of type.
That's okay. I do that all
I was just with how you talked about resistance against Black indigeneity, and just this discourse around Blackness of not belonging to place. And so I'm curious if there's also like settler claims to indigeneity going on here, with anyone else who's not necessarily from Morocco who necessarily identifies Black and so gets that access.
Right. So there's a lot going on that I understand some, but I am really not the person. So I'm going to gesture to some things, but I would not be the person to unpack this in detail. But first, indigeneity is kind of a weird concept. I think it translates kind of, I use that, but it translates strangely, partly because of the French. There's a little bit of a faux ami happening there in Morocco. But this denial of Black indigeneity, or maybe Black Amazigh identity has to do with this conflation with Blackness and slavery that Shuki El-Hamel talks about. So the idea is if you're Black, you're always from somewhere else. And, you know, very common, the most common term that I heard when I lived in Morocco that people would address Black people by was Sahrawi, like person from the South, from the Sahara. And so this idea that you're from another geography, from another place, would deny, you know, your right to presence. But there's also this dynamic in Morocco where Morocco itself is a settler state, right? Because it's occupying Western Sahara. And there's all kinds of really interesting racial dynamics in Western Sahara as well. So there's a lot going on there that I think would be fascinating for someone to unpack, but it's not the main focus for me right now. The region, the Tafila, where this came out for me, is such an interesting and diverse and varied region with a lot of history and culture that I haven't fully apprehended or investigated. And so I think, you know, someone who would do a really nuanced study of some of these questions would do well to kind of dive into that literature and think about it from that aspect.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Lydia, have I studied the specificities of Blackness in Rabat, the capital? I haven't, no. So the bulk, this is actually, in some ways, this paper is the follow-up to my research, because the bulk of my research is really focused on how the Euro-African border produces migrants as Black in order to legitimize violence against them and sort of to consign them to this other place, right? To this you know, zone of non-being, if you want to put it that way, or the ungeographic is how Catherine McKittrick talks about it. So and then I also think about it in terms of political economy, but the way that the border was impacting Moroccan society more broadly, and I could see this a little bit as kind of an outsider that was traveling and living there frequently. I moved there the first time in 2001, just a few weeks before September 11th in the United States. And then, you know, returned periodically for 1 or 2 year periods, you know, through 2017. So I was able to see how this was sort of this Blackness, illegality, migration as crisis, all of this discourse was becoming more and more prominent in Morocco over the 2 decades or so that I've been, you know, living or moving around there. So definitely, you know, I've heard things similar about Rabat, but I haven't done a particular study of Rabat. Okay, Zainab says, I've read about how Moroccan authorities have a habit of quelling the formation of anti-racist civil society for a variety of possible reasons. Have I been pressured in any way or approached by the authorities while conducting my research? No, that's, you know, so one of my external advisors is Michael Collier, who's been doing research on migration in Morocco and the region since like 1997. And, you know, he's really careful to emphasize that one of the reasons we're able to talk about Morocco as a violent border state or, you know, racism in Morocco or things like that is in part because they allow researchers to come and ask some of these questions. So, you know, you can't do this research in Algeria as easily as, at least as an American, as a US citizen. So in that sense, no, I haven't been limited. In another sense, you do have to get a research permit. And so I was encouraged by my host organization to be really careful about how I framed these questions and to speak in generalities. And in fact, my partner was doing historical research on the Reef, which is sort of a much more you know, was right in the midst of the Hirak Reefy kind of movement there, and he wasn't given a research permit, and in fact, his you know, was told not to do research. So, you know, so I think it varies by topic, but Morocco has been fairly accommodating to people who are doing research on migration, despite, you know, most of that research being pretty strong in critique.
if we have a couple of minutes, if there's not other questions, I'm interested to know a little bit more about this political economy that you mentioned, and I think that was a big part of your research and how it feeds into this whole situation.
Right. Yeah. So, in some ways I'm still puzzling that out a little bit, but there's an anthropologist, Ruben Anderson. There have been some other people as well, but he really wrote about the border, like this transnational border between Europe and Africa as an industry that exists to kind of circulate capital based on the illegality or the production of illegality of migrants. And other scholars have done that too. So the idea is, again, that the border can only exist as long as you're criminalizing people who are moving, and beyond that, that it feeds it feeds itself by through the accumulation of capital. So I'll give an example to be less abstract. So basically, when Europe infuses money into, grants big defense contractors, and in the 1990s, you have to remember this is like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War was sort of officially over. And so suddenly you had all these defense contractors who didn't have markets anymore to sell their wares or their weapons and their technologies. So they repackaged them for civilian use and have advertised them as being able to track migrants and to protect migrants is one of the languages that they use. So that sort of has kept the defense industry for a while. That kept them going for a while. And it's become, the expenditures have become higher and higher. And I would point to the Transnational Institute and Mark Ackerman, who is someone who's done research on that. And then, of course, as borders get stronger and it gets harder to get across, you have smugglers, right, who are also suddenly, not making a little bit of money, just helping someone, like directing them through the desert somewhere, but suddenly, having to buy gear and night vision and, all of these things, and also can charge a lot more money to migrants and refugees who want to cross because it's gotten a lot more dangerous and they need their specialized expertise. So, there's a certain group in the south of Algeria who I think during the refugee crisis of 2015 said they made something like $1 billion. I don't know if it's true or not, but there's tremendous money in that. And so what I do is try to link that to race and think about it through a racial capitalist lens, where it's not just the production of illegality, criminalizing people, but it's also the production of race, that making people who are Black and are on the move, targets of the border, both defense contractors, states, but also humanitarian agencies and also smugglers. All of these people are like trying to get a piece of the pie. It's driven by sort of a racial logic. So that's where I connect those two things together. And I'm still thinking through how that works and what the utility of a racial capitalist idea is. But I think it also, political economy we often think of as centered around labor. And I don't think this is centered just around labor. It's not just about bringing people from Africa to Europe in precarious condition and being able to exploit their labor, but it's actually just exploiting their movements and their bodies and making money off of that. So that's what I'm focused on. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Hey, Leslie. First of all, I'm so sorry because I missed the bulk of your talk, and I think I came just in the last 5 minutes because I had actually a prior meeting. But I find this really fascinating just from the Q&A and the questions that are being asked. But I just wanted, probably my question more on your research, and I find that, and you just mentioned this, my understanding is that lately there has been sort of strict rules actually in getting your permission as far as sort of migration, because, and you actually mentioned this just earlier, the fact that, it's so sort of paradoxical that the state would give you permission and you have to go through all these loopholes. However, a lot of research that's being produced is sort of skate into the state or sort of scathing critique of the state. And I'd like just to hear a little bit from you as far as like the generalization that you've mentioned, that like sort of, you know, to get like sort of research permit, you have to somewhat tweak your questions, which can be problematic sometimes, because there's always this sort of like, oh, yeah, and I know this very well. Like even like I know people that wanted to do research in Western Sahara, and they would not even be allowed to actually even come close to there or even have any sort of interlocutors, which is really, really hard. And anybody that would even envision doing research there would not be even, and I know someone that tried to sort of like try to work on divorce and tweak things to be able to get even to that territory. Sort of long-winded, but could you say a bit about it? Because it's really sometimes so hard, because also when you're doing research and you want to get like sort of your search permit, there are all these committees and things you go through that you have to sort of like say, here is what I'm really doing. And at times you might also have to, I think about Egypt, just to give you an example, you talk about Algeria, where at times like people even having, wanted to apply for the Fulbright and actually get the Fulbright, they were rejected because there are certain questions that the way they formulated the questions sort of was not welcomed by the committee or by the state. So I just want to hear a little bit about, especially that you've spent a lot of time in Morocco back and forth with your partner and doing a lot of work there. And like, are there any, probably you had a very, very like clear road. You didn't have a lot of obstacles, also probably because of your affiliation. But I want to hear more this sort of tension between, yes, you can get your permit. However, it's a very repressive system that's really careful about what people write about it, and still they're escaping critique. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, totally. I think I'll answer that question. I'll zoom out a little bit to sort of ethics in general. And also just, my position. Not only am I a white American, but I had a research affiliation with a very prominent a university in Morocco, El Akhouane University, and I have a long history with them. So I was leveraging a lot of my privilege that other researchers might not have access to. If you're South African, they're not going to let you like come to the country, probably, much less do research. And there's lots of other examples. So so I think that was part of it. And actually, I mentioned talking to the 3 Meknesi researchers and when I was first starting, and I was like, well, how do you go about getting access and, going into the camps and stuff like that? And they said, oh, well, you're a white American, no problem. You just walk right in, And so there are ways in which that position, right, for better or worse, and probably for worse, enabled me to do that. In terms of generalities, I'll be really honest. I'm an over discloser, if you haven't noticed that already in this talk. And I wrote out very detailed research proposal for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Interior. And then somebody else that was in the sponsoring institution edited it for me. So, and probably had a better eye for the sort of political nature
Absolutely.
of the project and how I should do it. But I mean, I think there's an ethics too to what you disclose and what you don't disclose, and how you, and also like what you go in expecting to see. And I think my situation was a little different because I'd been in Morocco for so long and had already encountered, the experience of being with migrants who were experiencing violence and over policing and things like that. So I kind of knew what I was probably going to find. But I think we also have to think about that and be really careful for going in expecting to find, racism, or expecting to overlay our particular, epistemological orientation onto a new context. That can be problematic as well. So, yeah. So I think it is something, and I think it was helpful for me that I was, affiliated with a Moroccan institution, not just for the, for the kind of greasing the wheels, but also because it kept me a little bit more accountable to scholars who were doing similar work, who were from the country or who were long-term residents of the country. And so I didn't feel like I was quite so much of a lone cowboy doing a lot of this work, and had some accountability, not just to my research interlocutors, West and Central African migrants, but also to other folks in the region who were experts on this and were, asking me questions and talking through these issues with me as well.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I mean, and the reason really why I ask you that, because I know someone who recently actually wanted to do similar work, and it was actually rejected. But you're right, the whole politics of access and affiliation, I mean, it absolutely makes total sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I will say, I think Morocco is getting a little stricter on research permits. So that is true.
There is a question from Liz Grismer and about the data protections which she worked on, and also from Mame. So if you can reply to these two questions, I think this will be the last two ones for the.
Great. Okay, so Liz, I don't know if I can talk about the externalization of the border in Morocco and how it plays out through technology and data collection, in part because a lot of the, from the state perspective, the Ministry of Interior is the one who keeps the most accurate and I'm sure exhaustive data on this, and they're not telling anyone. So, so that's sort of a black box. I know that in terms of UNHCR, migrants are fingerprinted now, and that has to do with where people can make asylum claims, and this push to get people to seek asylum in Morocco and other third countries rather than in Europe itself. So those are the two things I really know about data in Morocco. That hasn't been something, because my research was so ethnographic among migrants, it wasn't something that that I encountered that much, except, sort of death by paperwork. And especially the regularization process, you had to submit a ton of papers. You had to get a police report, and, if you could find your birth certificate and all of those things. And from my perspective, that was a really effective way to get more information and better sense of who migrants were, where they were from, how many there were, and just keep track of people. So I do see the regularization program as also being a way to keep that data. But again, it went to the Ministry of Interior. So, and I don't know who they're sharing it with. And then Iman, have there been moments in your fieldwork where you were emotionally affected by what you've seen and heard? Yes. Yes, there definitely were. But I would say one thing is that the people that I was with were just living their lives, right? West and Central African migrants had really hard times. Things were often really bad, but they were also, oh my gosh, sorry, a bird just hit the window. Things were really bad, but they were also not victims, right? In sort of this unidimensional sense. And so being with them, and that sense of community that was in those communities always lightened the load. I mean, that's the best way that I can say it. And not just, I think, for me, but also for them. I think where I felt heavier was when I came back and was going back through my field notes and writing it up. And I found writing it up really hard. But second, I decided not to include very many examples at all from my field work. So a lot of my book manuscript is drawing on just a few anecdotes and unpacking them because I don't want to expose people in that particular way. Especially when it's at their heart, sometimes at their hardest or their lowest spot. And also because I think there's been plenty of documentation about how hard it is to be a West or Central African migrant on the move. And you don't need more specificity from me on that. So that's kind of how I dealt with that. I should also just add that, really the reason that I came to this project, it wasn't my original intention, but having lived in Morocco, I just met migrants. And I was a member of the Protestant church in Morocco, which became, really started diverting a lot of its attention to helping migrants, many of whom were filling the congregations across the country. And so for me, it was really just about kind of looking around at where I'd been and what was happening there in a country that I love. I love it. My first child was born in Morocco, and it's a place that's really special to me. But I wanted to think more about what these changes are that I'd witnessed over 2 decades were really about. And also to locate a lot of that culpability or responsibility in Europe and more broadly in white supremacy and the legacies of colonialism and racial capitalism. So that's what brought me to this project.